Welcome back to the Career Profiles podcast. And this episode is one episode that we're really excited to do. And it's a cliche for us saying we're really excited because we always get excited about a lot of these episodes. But this one's a little bit more personal for the pair of us because it's a fighter which we've grown up with. It's a fighter in which we've got to see the trials and tribulations of. And we're talking about the legendary Frank Bruno. He's an absolute legend in our neck of the woods. Everybody loves him in the UK. We really do love him. And people might look at him and go, well, what did he really achieve in his career? He wasn't like he was a 3-time world champion or anything like that. The thing is, he's just such a lovable guy and a lovable character. And a character, like any other human being, has his flaws and has his moments. And we're really here to tell his story and document this story about Frank Bruno and his struggles and everything he went through and just the sheer heart and determination that one individual human being can have to be able to chase that one dream. And I think for us, he's like the epitome of like the cliche sayings of never give up. Like you see these cliche sayings, don't you? Never give up. Don't let your dreams fade away. And I think Frank Bruno is one of those individuals in boxing who never let his dream fade away. He completely chased that dream until he finally achieved it. And this is what this story is all about. It's a story of a man with heart, determination, and just a human being.
Well, I'm just going to start with Bruno, absolute legend. I mean, look, I'm not even joking. As a child, this guy was my hero, to be honest with you. He was the guy that pulled me in boxing. He really was. And yes, he is in a 3-time world champion. He has an old multiple weight class division. Obviously, he's heavyweight, but still he didn't bust everyone up. When he stepped up levels, he lost, and then he finally won. But you know what? It didn't matter. It didn't matter to us. We loved him because he was like us. He was a genuine, down-to-earth kind of guy that we all recognised and see and worked alongside or went to school with. And that's what it was. And you wanted that guy to do well. You did. And it's crazy to say it, but, Lennox Lewis is the best heavyweight we've ever produced, other than obviously Tyson Fury now as he is. He's competing with him. But other than that, nobody. And I'm telling you now, the only person that pushes this man in terms of absolute just the gratitude and the hero status is only Henry Cooper. Henry Cooper, another guy that didn't ever win a world title. Bruno did. So Henry Cooper and Frank Bruno are the two guys that Lennox Lewis, Tyson Fury, Anthony Joshua, Dillian White, whoever you want to throw out there, they will never, ever, ever pull the heartstrings that this man did, and those two in particular. They won't ever do it. No one will ever do it again. So that's why we love Frank Bruno, and that's why we're doing a career profile on him.
Absolutely. And it all begins, of course, when he was born Franklin Roy Bruno on November the 19th, 1961, in Hammersmith Hospital, London. He lived with his parents, Lynette and Robert Bruno, along with his 3 sisters, Faye, Angela and Joan, and 2 brothers, Michael and Eddie. Robert was born on the Windward Island of Dominica and arrived in England along with many immigrants during the Windrush generation from 1945 to 1960. Unfortunately for Robert, he suffered with heart problems and diabetes, so was bedridden a lot of the time. And Frank himself recalled, "Many of my earliest memories are of the time while he himself up on a makeshift bed in the lounge listening to cricket on the radio. Back then, my hero was the West Indian legend Gary Sobers, and my dad would always encourage me to go out and play cricket. I loved the sport, and I wasn't a bad little bowler." Due to his dad having health problems, his mother had to be the main breadwinner. Lynette was born in Jamaica and moved to England when she was a child, and Frank explained, "My mother was a district nurse and had 5 kids already when I arrived in 1961. She travelled around the Wandsworth Borough on home visits looking after those in need, but found time to get back to the family home at 39 Barmouth Road in South London to cook dinner for the whole family." From the moment Frank arrived in this world, it was like he was born to fight, and he told the Guardian newspaper, "Mum told me that as a baby I would try to smash my way out of my cot. The fire and aggression that served me so well in the boxing ring was there from the start." His upbringing was not any different to anyone else living in this era. It was tough, but he always knew his family loved him.
Yeah, Frank explained his early background saying that I enjoyed a fantastic childhood. My folks, especially my old man, they were really strict, but they were fair and full of love too. On a few occasions, my dad reached for the curtain rod and brought it down on me. It was always because I had done something really naughty. He also explained to the Mirror newspaper that if I was out of order, he would drop some monies on you. This was the way families disciplined their kids back in these days. But the level of his father's discipline could almost border cruelty. And Frank admitted that if he had done it in this day and age, he'd be banged up with a curtain wire and whatever. But that's old school for you. I mean, it was just the way it was. And on top of his mum's nursing job, Lynette also worked as a preacher at the local church in Fulham. And Frank recalled that even as a very young boy, I always remember feeling really proud of my mum. I saw the way people in church would look at her and I could sense the respect they had. I found out many years later how my mum would spend a lot of her time in the evenings counselling and supporting the members of the community who were going through tough times. I'd find out myself years later how important this special gift which my mum possessed would be. Although Frank's mum was a patron saint of the community, she certainly didn't take any shit from her son, any of her boys or her daughters, and would feel no way about straightening them out if needs be. And he said that mum was a preacher, so we were always reminded of what would happen to us if we didn't behave. She was strict, but I was more scared of my father. He was a classic West Indian dad, very loving but always very firm. Frank said, Mum always knew how to dish out a telling off, and I got more than a couple in my early years.
Frank also said he wasn't a nasty kid or a bully, but I always was a bit of a tearaway. Frank attended Swaffield Primary School and was a lot bigger than most of the kids his age, and he remembered, I found it was quicker and usually more straightforward to settle an argument with a ruck rather than a chat. Pretty quickly, I was spending less time playing cricket in the street and more time running with some of the tearaways, turning Wandsworth into a bit of a dangerous playground. When Frank was just 8 years old, he got himself into a spot of bother, and he recollected, me and one of my mates had been hanging around the streets all day when we came across a barrel of beer that had been turfed into the street. Neither of us knew what it was at first, but when we opened it, our eyes lit up. I remember taking a sip and thinking it tasted horrible, but we just kept on necking it until the whole barrel was empty. I think between us, we drank about 8 pints each in less than a couple of hours. Even my old mate, Gazza, would struggle to go that quickly. I was swaying all the way home and my head was spinning when I fell through the door. God knows what my mum was thinking as she saw me rocking from side to side and in a right old state. Moments later, I was sick all over the house. "Franklin," she screamed, "what's the matter with you?" I remember trying to mumble something back without making any sense. I can still recall the way I felt the next morning. It was a worse headache than after some of my fights. The whole episode, it put me off drinking for life, and I rarely touched the booze, even today.
Well, Lynette and Robert were disappointed with their youngest, of course. But as Frank explains, instead of getting a clip round the ear, he, as in his dad, got up and out of bed and he told me to put my jacket on because we were taking a trip out. At first, I thought we was going to take me back to where we'd found the barrel and apologise to whoever it belonged to, etc. Instead, we went into a different direction, and minutes later, he was ushering me through the door of Earlsfield Boxing Club in Southfield, southwest London. "Time to grow up, Frank," my dad said. "If you're going to get in trouble and into fights, then fight in here from now on." I felt a few butterflies when I looked around me. For once, I wasn't the bravest kid in the room, but I knew from the moment I pulled on my first pair of gloves that boxing was the sport for me. And as with many of these career profiles we tell, young Frank was taught a harsh lesson from the get-go by a kid 5 years older than he was, called Gary Levington, whose dad actually also worked in the gym. Now, because they couldn't find anyone the size of Frank at his age, they let Gary box his head off. and he broke him down to the point where Frank actually cried. He returned home with his towel between his legs and was knocked down a peg or two. Rather than feel sorry for himself, though, and his mum feels sorry for him, Frank's mum actually turned around and said, "It's not the sport I would pick for you, Franklin, but at least you may now burn off some of that energy." So Frank, well, he weren't deterred. In fact, he was even more hungry than ever to return back to that gym and to improve. He returned to the gym the next day after school and continued until boxing became the centre of his life.
Frank explained, "I'd get home later and later each night for tea because I was trying to cram every spare minute into training. Any maths or English homework went out the window. I was only interested in boxing." In just his first year, Frank confessed, "I even won a national title, my first belt. Mind you, I can't shout too loudly about it because I didn't even have a single fight. They couldn't find anyone big enough to take me on, so I got a pass in every round including the final. I was a champion without even throwing a single punch." Academically, Frank did not excel, but he was making a name for himself around school as a good boxer, which gave him a target on his back. Many of the older kids decided to take the chances against Big Frank, and we're guessing many were left rendered and wondering what had happened many times in that school playground. But it wasn't a fellow pupil that got Frank in deep water, it was a teacher. And he admitted, "In my final year at Swaffield Primary, we'd gone to Hyde Park for a day trip when I was fooling around with one of the girls in the class who had a camera. It dropped to the floor, and then so did me and my teacher. We were wrestling for a few seconds and tumbling around. It was later said I knocked the geezer out, which was nonsense. I was only 11 after all." A good friend of Frank's at Swaffield School, Simon Bays, recalled the incident with the teacher, and he said, "Frank left Swaffield a little earlier than we all expected due to a slight misunderstanding with a teacher. I don't think Frank meant any harm. He wasn't a bully or a troublemaker. In fact, he was the opposite of that. And if he saw you in trouble or getting any aggro, he was more likely to step in and play peacemaker."
Yeah, a bit of a misunderstanding. Well, Frank was marched off to the headmaster's office where he met his mum, and he was expelled from school. On top of that, that teacher told him, "I'm sending you to a special school, a long way from here, Frank. And it's a place in the country for boys like you who have a problem with discipline. Make the most of this opportunity, young man. It could be the last one you get." Well, Simon said his mate, he was gutted to see him leave Swaffield. He was always great fun to be around, and after he left school, it just didn't feel the same. Well, Frank Bruno explained in his book, which was a great source for this, so 60 Years of Fighter, Frank, definitive and explosive story of my life in and outside the ring. And he said, "One morning, the following week, I packed my suitcase. I was only 11 years old, and my day out to Hyde Park was one of the few times I'd actually left Wandsworth. Now I was heading for a school called Oak Hall in Sussex, more than 100 miles away. His mum accompanied him by coach to what was effectively a ball stall, which housed 60 of the naughtiest in London. Now, Frank's hardly the most unlawful of the kids and found it hard going, not only because he would be away from his mum and his family, but because he also got bullied in the first few weeks while he was there. But because he wasn't allowed to box as well, that also pissed him off. And he admitted that the ring they had quickly became the only place I felt at peace in life. And it was there where I felt calm and happy. So on his first night at this ball stall, he actually cried himself to sleep. And then the early weeks were even more difficult because one of the kids actually took an instant disliking to him. He was actually smaller than Frank, but he had a gang of about 10 other kids behind him. Too many for young Frank to deal with.
He had to endure this nasty bully's tactics, and he explained what this kid used to do, and he said, in the dining room, he'd shove a spoon in his tea and then hold it against my neck. I'd scream out in pain, but he and his mates would just sit back laughing. At meal times, he'd pick his nose and rub his fingers all over my food, grinning from ear to ear. If he saw me in the corridor, he'd chase after me. Frank contemplated escaping after his first few weeks. He had it all planned and even did a few trial runs, but he couldn't go through with it, thanks to one of the female staff members. She found out about his great escape and convinced him to stay, and he admitted that her words hit home, so he stuck it out. Although Oak Hall never provided Frank with the chance to box, well, at least at first anyway, it did many other sports like cricket, football, canoeing, horse riding, judo, tennis, cross-country and basketball, which Frank threw himself into. He began to enjoy the routine that the school provided, and soon enough he was too exhausted to act up, which back then would have ended with the cane. Soon the bullies left him alone, and he began to make friends. Ironically, it was during the school holidays while visiting home that Frank got caught up in trouble, and he recalled, "A gang of us went up to Selfridge's in London's West End, and a couple of my mates were nicking bits and pieces. We all got stopped by the store detective who called the old bill. Luckily, the copper they sent to deal with it was from Wandsworth, and he knew my mum as he went to our local church. He realised the punishment from her would be far worse than anything he could dish out, so I got away with a slap on the wrist."
Well, Frank actually lived close to Wandsworth Prison, and when he walked past, it literally put the fear of God into him, because one day he thought he might actually end up there. And he said, "A few of my friends ended up in jail, and I might have done too, if it weren't for my parents. My mother used to pray for me. Dad preferred more earthly solutions. Every time I went off the rails, I broke their hearts." He then confessed, "The truth is, I was always too much of a coward to be a criminal." Although Oak Hall had a boxing ring, as we've mentioned, and they never allowed their kids to really use it. In fact, they never used to allow them to do any sparring. But that was until Frank, now 13 years of age, he persisted to the point they actually gave in. And he explained that, "I owe a hell of a lot to one of the PE teachers." His name was John Irwin, who seemed to have a soft spot for me. He saw my potential straight away, and he could also tell how passionate I was to do well. So as well as letting me spar, he came up with a little training routine for me, and I followed it to the letter. He had me legging it round the field in a bin liner, sweating my nuts off. Well, Frank was eager to put his hard graft into action, but as we've said, due to his size, he was never able to find an opponent. The one day Frank finally got his chance, and he recalled it like it was yesterday. He said, "Eventually, I finally got through the ropes to fight against a very good local amateur called Paul McDonald at his club in Claygate, Surrey." Now, Frank was a big kid, obviously. As you can tell, he probably would have been. And it's almost hard to believe this, but he was nervous, and he acknowledged it. He said, "There were a fair few butterflies in my gut before the bell. I felt the same nerves in my last professional fight as I did in my first as a kid."
Frank continued, "It, as in the nerves, just never go away. You have to keep a lid on it and try not to let it turn to fear, because boxing is a serious business at any level." He spoke of his admiration of boxers at any level and said, "Anyone who has the bottle to get in a ring and fight is, in my opinion, a very brave person and deserves maximum respect. That's why you will never find me mugging off any boxer." And true to his word, he never did. The fight against McDonald was stopped in the second round, and Frank Bruno had won his first bout in boxing. On his return to Oak Hall, he was celebrated by his teachers and schoolmates, and he finally felt like he belonged. Then Frank's life was turned upside down, and he remembered, "Halfway through one of my lessons, I was called in to see the head, Mr. Lawrence, in his office. 'Sir,' I said pleadingly, 'whatever it is I'm supposed to have done, I just want to say.' 'Frank, please sit down,' he said. I knew by the look on his face, and the fact he hadn't addressed me as Bruno, that I wasn't in trouble. 'I'm sorry to tell you that your father has died, Frank. You must see this as a merciful release from his suffering.' I sat there stunned. I'd realised during my holidays back home that Dad was getting worse, but I never expected him to be taken so soon. Aged 13, I suddenly had to come to terms with the fact my dad was gone. Incredibly, earlier that day, I'd been walking through the school grounds and heard his voice. He was crying and calling out my name. I'm convinced it was Dad, saying goodbye."
When Frank arrived home, he refused to break down in front of his mum, she was an emotional wreck, basically. He managed to keep it together until he was alone. And he said, "I went upstairs and cried in my room. I glanced out my window and saw some kids playing cricket in the street, and thought of those long summer days when Dad and I would sit together listening to the West Indies on the radio. At that very moment, There and then, I secretly vowed to do something that would make my dad proud. Really proud. Obviously, that was to become a champion. Now, he was finished at Oak Hall as well. He returned home as well after that. But all he could think about, the only thing he had in his head was boxing. So he decided to dedicate his life to it. His brother Michael was his biggest fan, even going as far as writing on the kitchen wall in black marker, Frank Bruno, heavyweight champion of the world, 1986. His mother wasn't best pleased with Michael, obviously, for writing on the wall, and she gave her son some wise advice, telling Frank during that summer, after leaving Oak Hall, you need to get a trade behind you, Frankie. You can't rely on this boxing dream of yours to pay the bills. So he found a job at a metal polishing factory near where he lived, earning 43 quid a week. He stuck at it for a while until he began working as a plumber's assistant. However, he was better at the heavy lifting of the baths and the sinks, so that job didn't last very long, and he left it. By 16, he was standing at 6 foot 3 inches tall and weighing 15 stone. So Bruno joined the Sir Philip Game Amateur Boxing Club in Croydon. He linked up with a trainer called Freddie Ricks, who he praised as his first real boxing trainer. He said he taught me the art of boxing, how defence was as important as attack, and how to mix up my combinations.
Frank said he, as in Freddie Ricks, started equipping me with the skills I'd need to have any chance of making it as a pro. But Freddie had the same problem as my teachers at Oak Hall, finding someone to fight me. He fought a couple of older kids, and those fights went well until he was taught another harsh lesson, once again in the boxing ring. I got the biggest shock of my life when I came up against a really tough Irish international by the name of Joe Christie. He knocked me across the ring like a flipping ragdoll. I don't know where I was by the end of the fight. I was just happy to hear the bell. Although Frank took a while to get over the beating sustained by Christie, it was this sort of lesson that he needed, and as he said himself, it was a lesson that had come to in my life again and again. So what happened with Christie stood me in very good stead. It wasn't long before Frank was back in the ring and knocking out a couple of bodies and getting back in the groove again. When at home, he would spend most of his time watching fights on TV, along with endless Muhammad Ali videos, and as Frank recalled, it used to do my poor mum's head in. I think she preferred Corrie. It was around this time that Frank's old schoolmate Simon recalled the moment he bumped into him again, and he said, I didn't see Frank again until I was in the Lonsdale boxing shop in Brixton when I was about 16. Many years may have passed, but Frank and I recognised each other straight away.
Yeah, and Simon continued, he said, Frank explained to me how he had got into boxing, and I wasn't surprised. He was always a big lad, but by the time he turned 16, he really was a very commanding figure. I remember thinking that anyone who got in the ring with Frank was going to have a serious problem on their hands, and so it proved. A year later, and Frank was trying to find extra assistance to enhance his knowledge as a boxer, and he identified the highly respected George Francis, who was training some of the top professionals around at the time, fighters like John Conte. So he felt his chances of landing such an established coach were limited. However, he took the chance anyway, and he walked in his Highgate gym in North London in 1978. Interestingly, Frank was surprised to find out that George had already heard about this massive heavyweight teenager and was just as eager to have him work out in his gym as he was to work out in his gym. And Frank recalled that I went 3 rounds with one of his fighters. Then as I stepped out and climbed back through the ropes, he shouted, "Wait, where you going, Bruno? You finish when I say." I was panting for breath and absolutely shattered, but I wasn't going to argue. George had me in for 3 more rounds, and I could barely stand after that. But even then, he got me down on the floor doing exercises. Frank was actually over the moon when George asked him to come back the next day. And it was George's training sessions that took Bruno onto another level as a fighter. Frank and George, they clicked automatically from the first day, which gave Bruno confidence. He was then confident enough to take that rematch against Joe Christie. But there was a catch. He had to travel to Ireland to seek his revenge.
Frank recalled, when I turned up at the Stardust Club in Dublin, Joe's home patch, I was about as welcome as a Millwall fan in a West Ham boozer. on the Canning Town High Road. But the fight went well, really well. I learned from what went wrong in the first contest, and I took Joe out easily. The win was very significant for Frank because he was now being hounded by many promoters and managers for when he made the transition over to the professional ranks. But Frank was not silly. He could spot a wrong 'un a mile off, and he said, "The person I clicked with more than anyone was a lovely fella called Terry Lawless. I loved Tell's style from the off. He seemed to care about his boxers, and I noticed, unlike some of the other geezers trying to sign me up, Terry didn't always talk about boxing. Boxing won't last forever, Frank," he would often say. "Make sure you always have another trick up your sleeve. Your brain can make you as much money as your fists." Frank felt a chemistry with Terry from the start. He saw him as a person and not just as a boxer. So he decided to sign with him. Because he was still young, he needed his mother's approval for her to sign the professional papers. Frank reflected back on that when he said, "She said, I am not sure if I want my Franklin to be paid to get beaten up or indeed beat other people up." It was only when Terry mentioned the money that could be earned and added that I could buy Mum a new hat and coat that she suddenly changed her mind. In fact, she looked at Terry and said, "Okay, Mr. Lawless, maybe I could buy a new handbag as well."
As an amateur, Bruno won 20 out of 21 fights and picked up a gold medal at the 1978 English National Championships, where he was named the most outstanding boxer. Finished third at the European Championships in 1978 and represented England at the 1978 World Championships. But the highlight for Frank was when he won the ABA Heavyweight Championship in 1980, defeating Rudy Pica and becoming the youngest to do it at the age of 18. He also followed in the footsteps of another much-loved heavyweight called Henry Cooper. It was now time to turn over to the professional ranks and start earning some dough. And with Terry as the boss, he created the perfect team, and he brought in promoter Mickey Duff and his associates Jarvis Astaire and Mike Barrett. Although Terry had final say over who Frank boxed, their job under Mickey's watch was to help set up fights, arrange venues, fix dates, finalise TV rights, and most importantly, sort out the money. Now, George Francis was actually removed as trainer at this point, and he was replaced by Jimmy Tibbs. He would come back. The team was strong, and all Frank had to do was win his fights, and the fights they arranged. However, there was a slight complication, and this is what Frank explained. So he said a guy called Bert McCarthy turned up at his house in Wandsworth in his Rolls Royce with a suitcase full of cash. Stupidly, I was taken in by it all. Well, I say stupid. What teenager wouldn't have their head turned a bit? Old Bert was dripping in gold chains and rings and had more patter about him than Del Trotter. Well, yeah, it was a real this time next year we will be millionaires type spiel. He was also telling me how he could open the doors, which I like the sound of. So before I knew it, it was happening, and I signed a piece of paper, but I didn't think much about it.
That piece of paper that Frank signed was a legally binding contract, and although a very pissed off Terry Lawless eventually saw Bert off, the whole saga dragged on for years. All Frank needed to do now was pass his medical, which should have been plain sailing, but unfortunately he failed due to a rare weakness in his right retina that made him short-sighted. Terry and Mickey managed to locate a doctor who confirmed the issue, but offered to get his eye corrected by surgery. The catch was that there were only two countries that offered this surgery. One was in Moscow in Russia and the other was in Bogota, Colombia. Due to Russia still sort of being under Soviet Union rule and being a little harder to navigate than Colombia, a trip to Bogota became the only option. Frank said that Terry explained he wasn't able to come with me. It might take a few weeks to get you fixed, Frank. I've got all the other boys in the stable to think about as well. We've also got someone at the other end who will meet you and look after you. It'll be fine. So off went 20-year-old Frank to Colombia alone to have surgery on his right eye that might not even work. When Frank landed in February of 1981, the contact wasn't there to meet him, but he managed to communicate with an English-speaking taxi who took him to his hotel. From there, Frank met with the doctor, who then performed the surgery successfully. He even indicated that he could be back in London fighting by April. He was advised to rest in his hotel for a few weeks, which was all going well, but as with any young man, it wasn't long before Big Frank got bored.
Well, he met a couple of so-called friends who were getting him some weed, so he was just smoking a few spliffs to pass the time, nothing too sinister. Now, when his new mates asked him to a barbecue at a close friend's house, they said, on the outskirts of the city, they said plenty of fun, music, girls and champagne, they promised him. And Frank, well, he accepted, of course he did, why not, he's bored. And he explains what happened next. He says, well, after weeks lying on my back, I was ready to have a bit of fun. It was one of the worst moves I've made in my life, because half an hour or so, our host had his arm around my shoulder and was leading me to a quiet spot at the party. He clearly had something important to ask me. Listen, Frank, he whispered in my ear. That dope you are smoking is chicken feed. We'd like you to do us a little favour. We deal mainly in cocaine in LA, New York, London. I stepped back and immediately clocked that the friendly expression on his face had turned to one that meant very serious business. Why are you telling me all this? I asked. Well, Frank, you will be leaving us soon. But when you return to London, we'd like you to deliver a little parcel for us. He then placed a piece of paper in my hand which had an address in London on it. I screwed it up in my fist. Come on, Frank, he said, clocking my reaction. We're all friends here. You'll be doing us a big favour. And this is a dangerous town. Crazy things happen to people here. I knew what he was hinting at. Since landing in Bogota, I had seen enough stories on the news about shootings. But I stood my ground. I'm not interested, I said firmly.
Frank then began to look around the room for the friends who'd set him up. But unsurprisingly, as he reflected, they'd long scarpered. Charming, I muttered sarcastically under my breath. I played the only card I had left. Do you know why I'm out here, sir? I said. But Mr. Cocaine looked at me blankly. Hopefully, in a couple of months, I'm going to be on the TV back home knocking people out, I said. Then in a few years after that, I'm going to be a world champion. He could see where I was going. I was making it clear that I might be small fry to him in the drugs jungle of Bogota, but if any harm came to me, it would make the papers back home. If they were planning to do me in, and hope no one would notice, then he was sadly mistaken. I could see his demeanour change after that, and he smiled uneasily. We made a bit more small talk for half an hour or so, then I made my excuses and left. I didn't even get time for a hot dog. Charming, eh? I was looking over my shoulder for the rest of my stay, though. I'd got into the odd scrap in my time back in South London, but this was something else. I was mixing with millionaire cocaine dealers who were bumping off people left, right and centre. I couldn't believe I'd let myself get into such a daft spot. I was tempted to ring Terry and have a moan about being sent over on my own, but at the same time, I didn't want to let on what had happened. Suddenly, the thought of sitting in a darkened room and letting my eye heal sounded lovely, so I retreated to my room for the rest of my stay in Bogota.
Well, after a checkup at the hospital, he was signed off by the doctor as having the vision needed to be a professional fighter. And Frank again reflected that I could see clearly now, and life was about to get very exciting indeed. Bruno arrived home and he made his professional boxing debut against Lupe Guerrera at the Royal Albert Hall on March 17, 1982. The fight was over in 152 seconds and Bruno was off and running. 2 weeks later at Wembley Arena, Frank stopped American Harvey Steechin in 2 rounds, and a month later he knocked out his third victim, Tom Stevenson, back at the Royal Albert Hall. The crowd actually booed due to the lack of effort by his opponent, and he even had his purse withheld by the British Boxing Board of Control, poor fella. Frank recalled that he stumbled out of the ring like a drunk falling out of a boozer on a Friday night. Even this early into Frank's career, and the media were already questioning his level of opposition, which was a bit unfair considering he only had 3 professional fights, but their rumblings would be valid 15 or 20 fights in. Frank didn't allow the critics to discourage his positivity, and he just continued to train as hard in the famous old gym above the Royal Oak pub in Canning Town, which was already a legendary spot for churning out some of the best British champions and fighters. Frank looked back on those days very fondly, and he said that Jimmy Tibbs worked me tirelessly in the ring, and even after those early fights, which had ended in a flash, he would be picking up on things he felt I could improve on. Alongside him was Frank Black, who focused on my conditioning. They were a great double act. They were hard as nails, the pair of them, but they also had hearts of gold.
By the end of 1982, Frank had a record of 10 fights and 10 knockouts and was now living with his new pregnant girlfriend, Laura Mooney, at his mum's house and was still working part-time at the Lonsdale Sports Shop. Frank was training with Lloyd Honegan, who he would often meet up with after work to take the tube with. Well, one day, Lloyd wasn't around, so Frank was on his own as he got off the tube at Stratford. He suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder, thinking it was a ticket inspector. He span round to give them a sob story. But it wasn't. It was 4 skinheads who began shouting racist slurs at him and making monkey noises. Frank recalled, "I'd heard it all before. It was 1982, and sadly walking down the street would often bring aggro. I was on roller skates that afternoon. God knows why, but I used to love whizzing around on them, and I always wanted to get to the gym as quickly as I could too. So when I saw these 4 geezers, I tried to get out of there as fast as possible. I tried to give the skinheads the slip, but they were all somehow getting closer and closer. I could smell they'd been on the booze, and I knew the situation was about to get lively. It was only then, out of nowhere, I heard a booming voice from the other side of the platform. It was so deafening, I thought it was coming from the loudspeaker in the station. As I glanced across, I saw this fella, with eyes bulging, screaming in my direction. 'Oi, fucking leave it out, you lot,' he hollered. Before I knew what was happening, he was racing over the platform bridge and heading down the stairs towards us. 'Come on then, boys, let's even these numbers up a little bit, shall we?'
Frank continued that the 4 skinheads took one look at the guy, all 6 foot 4 inches and 17 stone of him, and suddenly they lost their will to fight. I can still see them fleeing with him on their tails, and before I could even say thank you, my guardian angel was holding out his hand. 'Cass Pennant,' he said, 'nice to meet you.' I didn't know it then, but at that time, Cass was actually the leader of the notorious hooligan group attached to my beloved West Ham United called the Intercity Firm. I probably couldn't have asked for a better bloke to have come to my rescue. I seriously count myself very lucky that Cass happened to be there that day, and I'd go as far as saying that he saved my life. Facing 4 skinheads, who Cass later said were armed with knives, meant I could have been cut to ribbons the moment they pounced. Even with my strength and boxing skills, I'd have been overpowered. I could have dealt with a couple of them, but against 4, they'd have been like a pack of wolves. Well, Frank and Cass, they remained friends ever since, and still today. In fact, Bruno was actually the catalyst in reuniting Cass with his dad, who lived in Jamaica as well. By 1983, Frank and Laura had their first child, Nicola, and by the summer, Frank was sent out to Chicago for his first fight in the United States. And this is what Frank remembered. He said, "I was really pumped up that night. Lloyd Honegan was on the undercard and Barry McGuigan was fighting too. The 3 of us were keen to put on a show and do Great Britain proud. I boxed really well in the first round and Mike Jameson couldn't get near me. Then in the second, I moved through the gears, and each time I come forward, I never thought I was going to miss. All the sweat, all the training, all the work came together, and I blasted Jameson out before the end of the second round."
Frank was now 17-0, with 17 knockouts, and he even impressed Angelo Dundee on commentary duty. He said, "Bruno is the best prospect to come out of Britain in a long, long time. He hits like a mule, but there are still some faults to iron out before he is the finished article. He walks in instead of gliding in on the balls of his feet, and he could get knocked out cold with a left hook." Advice that Frank should have listened to, because in his 19th fight on October the 11th, 1983, at the Royal Albert Hall against American Floyd Jumbo Cummins, he got his first real wake-up call. The fight was broadcast live on the BBC, and Frank recalled his rude awakening. He said, "Then, as I was preparing for the bell at the end of the first, boom, a clubbing right over the top caught me plumb, and I was all over the shop. Jumbo had got me clean on the jaw. Royal Albert Hall? At that point you could have told me I was back at Oak Hall, and I wouldn't have had a clue. Thank God for the bell. As it came, I fell into the arms of referee Mike Jacobs, who had a good look at me. But before he could stop the fight, my corner came across and guided me back to my stool. The next 30 seconds were suddenly the most important of my career. Terry was across screaming at me to focus on the job. Somehow Jimmy Tibbs sorted me out, and after a brutal second round, I slowly managed to win back control of the fight. Eventually Frank did get the job done in the 7th round, but Jumbo had given Bruno something to think about going forward. The critics were already making their feelings known about that level of opposition that Frank was facing, and after this win, they began to get even louder.
Yeah, biographer Kevin Mitchell was critical of the opposition that he was facing, and he explained that Frank's strengths were his power. He had a massive right hand that could knock out anybody, but some of his other opponents were very ordinary. The criticism I had at the time, and I haven't changed my mind, is that some of those fights never taught him anything at all. Slower, fatter, and smaller used to be the motto. Kevin Mitchell, who was also correct in his assessment, then recalled that there was a wake-up call against Jumbo Floyd Cummins, a tough ex-con with a big right hand, and many felt that Frank was being spoon-fed a succession of opponents that were carefully selected by his promoter Mickey Duff in partnership with Terry Lawless, which did him no favours at all. Not only was the fight significant, so was the interview after, which Frank recollected. He said, "Usually it would be Des Lynam doing the interviews, but as I took a gulp of my water bottle, I saw this fella coming towards me who looked like an old head teacher at Oak Hall. It was Harry Carpenter. That was some punch, Frank," Harry said. "You did well to recover from it." "What punch was that, Harry?" I shot back, and he smiled. It was the first time we'd met, and I'd grown up watching and listening to Harry on the telly. He was a legend, and as we sat there talking, I instantly realised why. He was a kind, down-to-earth geezer, very serious about his work, but also very respectful. I liked him straight away. I can't speak of Harry, but I do think there was definitely an instant rapport between us. During the interview, I threw a few, you know what I means, and I haven't got the foggiest idea where they came from. I was just shooting from the lip, being natural, and they came out.
Frank continued. The next day, as well as writing about my heroic comeback in the ring, a lot of the boxing journalists picked up on the banter between Harry and I. "Frank's new sparring partner is Harry," one of the headlines said, while another pointed out how I'd been the star of the night, both in and out of the ring. Over the next few days, when I was making my way to and from the gym, people were endlessly shouting, "All right, Frank, know what I mean, Harry?" 2 comfortable knockout victories later, and then Frank faced James Bone Crusher Smith at Wembley Arena on May the 13th, 1984. The prize for the winner, we thought on our Tyson Bruno Legendary Nights episode, was actually a fight against Larry Holmes. But Frank has actually since corrected this rumour and said, "Terry had told me the day before the fight he was lining up a contest against the talented American Mike Weaver. Win that, he said, and I was on course to fight for a world title. However, it was irrelevant in a fight that Bruno won every one of the first 9 rounds, fighting entirely behind the jab, and was presumably heading towards a disappointing one-sided points win. Smith, though, was fighting clever and had allowed Bruno to punch himself out before seizing his opportunity. He unloaded a barrage of punches on a tired Frank Bruno until he eventually stopped him in the 10th and final round. Frank reflected again in his book about this and said, "Harry could hardly believe what he was seeing. Oh my word," he screamed into his microphone as I crashed down and onto the canvas. "Where on earth does this leave the Frank Bruno story now?" Truth be told, in the moments after my defeat to Bone Crusher Smith, I had absolutely no idea where it left me. Like the punch which put me on the floor that night, I simply hadn't seen it coming.
A disappointed Bruno admitted Harry Carpenter straight after his first professional defeat, I got beat. I know there are a lot of people who might be laughing out there saying, I'm glad he got his backside handed to him or kicked. But, I'll be back, Harry. And Barry McGuigan, we did mention this again in a Legendary Nights episode, but Barry does sum up Bruno's imperfections in this fight, and as a fighter in general at this point, quite well. He said when he was hit and hurt, he was terribly vulnerable. His hands come down, his chin would go up, whereas most fighters would hold on and grab and pull. They would hold on for their dear life until their heads would clear or run away. But he didn't have the ability to do that. He just wasn't taught those abilities, basically. Now, many of the press were writing the same phrase of, I told you so, and that Frank was never going to win a world title, world championship. And even Terry Lawless actually told Frank in the dressing room straight after the fight, and this is what Frank said. He said that Terry told him, I think that's it for me, Frank. I don't know what you plan to do, but if you're going to carry on, maybe you should think about getting someone else to manage her. The next day, Frank was not having any of it, and he told Terry that this was not the end, it was just the beginning. And so he convinced him and they continued to work together. He took a few months away from the ring before he was back out in September, knocking out a guy called Ken LaCosta at Wembley Arena and laying in demons to rest. Then he followed it up with 2 more victories against Jeff Jordan by stoppage in 3 rounds, and then a 10-round points win over Philip Brown, and that was the first of his pro career, which rounded off 1984 in decent style. And before Christmas, Terry was back to being a more optimistic trainer again.
Terry said, "We are back on track, Frank. Next year, we will fight for the European title, and then..." But before he could finish, Frank interrupted and said, "And then we're going to be world champions, Terry." He smiled, nodded and said, "We'll have a bloody good go, Frank." The first hurdle was to overcome the European heavyweight champion, Anders Eklund, on October the 1st, 1985 at the Wembley Arena. The big Swede towered over Bruno, standing over 6'6", but the Londoner started well, working behind his impressive jab until he was caught again. He wasn't as badly hurt this time, but it certainly stiffened up his legs. Finally, in the 4th round, Bruno landed 3 big right hands, sending the big Swede down and unable to beat the count. Back at the Royal Albert Hall, and Frank Bruno was on the verge of his first world title shot, but first he had to get past Larry Fraser on December the 4th, 1985. He got the job done in 2 rounds with body shots, forcing Fraser to admit afterwards, "I've never been hit so hard." Bruno didn't fight again until the following year on March 4th, 1986, when he took on Jerry Coetzee at Wembley Arena in an elimination bout for the chance to take on Tim Witherspoon. The Los Angeles Times wrote, "Britain's Frank Bruno knocked out Jerry Coetzee just 1 minute 50 seconds into the first round of their scheduled 12-round elimination fight Tuesday night. Bruno knocked down the 30-year-old South African twice, the second time unleashing a hard right that left Coetzee, the former WBA champion, spread-eagled through the ropes." The article also clarified that the WBA champion Tim Witherspoon could be stripped of the title because traces of marijuana were found in his blood after he had won the title from Tony Tubbs in January. A hearing on Witherspoon's situation will be held Friday in Philadelphia.
Well, Witherspoon was eventually cleared to defend his title against Frank Bruno, which was scheduled for July 19, 1986. By that summer, Frank and Laura had moved into their own home and had their second daughter, Rachel. Now, with a world title shot confirmed, Frank was promoted so well that he had now become a fan favourite in Britain. He was cherished by the British public and elevated to the status of national icon, just like Emery Cooper had done before him. And Frank, like Al Emery, captured the nation's hearts and became a regular fixture on talk shows and televisions and adverts. So that break, they used it to market him so well. And the working class communities identified with Bruno, this successful black boxer who had worked his way up through poverty and the temptations of crime to become a patriotic Brit. I mean, it was well marketed. Even Lennox Lewis agreed. He said the 80s were boring until Frank Bruno came along. He changed how people looked at the sport. Every time he fought on TV, the public would go wild about it. And Professor Ben Carrington said that Frank Bruno's unthreatening nature was the secret to his success. In Britain, Bruno came to respect the acceptable force of black masculinity. So he was described by another reporter as being as cockney as snake kidney pie as well. We did mention this in Legendary Nights, but it's a great quote. Even Tim Witherspoon, when he arrived, he recalled, "I was public enemy number one when I arrived in London to fight Frank in 1986. I had to remind myself I was fighting against a boxer, not the King of England. That's how famous he seemed to be at the time." So before the fight, George Francis was brought back into the team. And Frank was delighted to have him back in as his old trainer. And there would be no excuses, he said. That's how he felt. The fight was scheduled for 1 a.m. to accommodate the American audiences. And this was an obligation that promoter, of course, Don King, had stipulated. However, Frank wasn't concerned. He had adopted his training methods so that the time would not be an issue.
On the day of the weigh-in, Frank was feeling in terrific shape, while Witherspoon looked out of sort. Before the fight, Terry told his apprentice, "This is it, Frank. This is what we are in the business for, and this is what we've been working towards. You've earned it. Now go out and get it. You might not get another chance." In front of 40,000 people at Wembley Stadium, Frank was in excellent physical and mental shape as he made his way to the ring for his first shot at the World Heavyweight crown. Frank recalled the magic moment he made his way to the ring. The Rocky Balboa music was playing, and I was making my way to the ring. I'd never heard noise like it. Wembley was rocking. "Bruno! Bruno!" The shouts went out. As I climbed through the ropes, I saw Laura sitting next to my mum. It was the first time Mum had been at any one of my fights, and I was determined to win the title as much for her as for myself. In contrast, Witherspoon recalled his ring walk and said, "Tens of thousands of people were screaming at me as I made my way to the ring at Wembley. It was the most hostile atmosphere I'd ever faced. All of the home crowd wanted to see me knocked out. I looked like a guy on my way to the gallows." But that didn't faze Witherspoon in any way. In fact, he was relishing the prospect of silencing the crowd. Frank took control of the first half of the fight, something he was able to do most of the time, but he was beginning to feel the pace from the second half onwards. It was a scheduled 15-rounder, but he admitted to be gasping for air after the 10th.
Witherspoon had definitely seized the initiative as he was beginning to out-jab Bruno, and he was now ahead on all three of the judges' scorecards going into the 11th round. And this is what Frank remembered and what happened in the 11th. So he said, "I landed two big rights that had him sucking for air. I felt I'd got his attention again, and he was on the back foot. So I stepped forward and then crunch. He countered with one of those chopping rights above my eye. It's a punch I'd noted in my mind and had seen hundreds of times on the videos, but I still couldn't stop it coming. Straight away, fog descended, and it felt as if someone had turned the volume up in the arena. My gloves dropped, and I was in front of a baying champion. Punches rained in. My brain was urging me to hit back, but my arms weren't working. I was sinking lower and lower until I felt the burn of the rope on my back. It was the only thing keeping me upright. Seconds later, the towel came in, and Terry was racing towards me. It was over, and Frank later admitted that losing to Tim Witherspoon was one of the lowest moments of my career, but like many things in my life, it probably happened for a reason. As I've always said, sometimes you need to get knocked down to win. Tim is one of the toughest fighters. I look back now, I don't feel any shame in losing to him. And then Frank, of course, the gentleman he was, showed his class in defeat, and Tim Witherspoon remembered that I was amazed the next day when the phone rang back in my hotel room. Who was it? It was Frank. I thought he was going to ask me for a rematch, but he only wanted to say well done.
Witherspoon recalled him saying, "Tim, it's Frank," said this booming voice at the end of the line. "I looked like E.T. this morning, boss. You deserved it, man. You're a great champion. I was choked when I put the phone down. No one had ever done that to me in my career." It was obvious to me at that point why Frank was so widely loved in the UK. Not only was he a great boxer, but he was a fantastic man as well. Unfortunately, It wasn't all pleasant. According to the reports after the fight, 200 chairs were destroyed by the alcohol-induced fans and 27 were arrested, with 10 police officers injured in the process. Even Witherspoon was stuck inside his dressing room with angry Bruno fans vying for blood. But thanks to Muhammad Ali, the crowd disappeared, a story we did mention in the Tyson-Bruno Legendary Nights episode. After failing at his first attempt of world heavyweight glory, Bruno was adamant that he could still fulfill his dream, and he remembered saying to Terry as he got back into serious training after the Witherspoon defeat, "I don't think I've hit anywhere near my peak yet. There is so much more in the tank." He was back to winning ways at Wembley Arena on March the 24th, 1987 against James Tillis. While the unified WBC and WBA heavyweight champion Mike Tyson sat next to Harry Carpenter at ringside, Bruno was hurt in the second but recovered to land his hammer right hand, followed by an accumulation of punches to force Tillis into submission in the 5th round. After the win, Tyson entered the ring and told him, "I commend you, you came out very well, and I'm very impressed." Tyson then said, "I look forward to meeting you in the future."
Unfortunately, Frank wouldn't meet Tyson in the near future. It would be another 2 years before they would fight for that undisputed world heavyweight titles. While Tyson would continue to reign supreme, Frank Bruno had 2 quick-fire fights, a first-round knockout win over Chuck Gardner in June, and in August, he stopped Reggie Gross in Marbella after 8 rounds. Both victories led Bruno to a huge domestic fight against veteran Joe Bugner at White Hart Lane in North London, which was Tottenham Hotspurs' ground. Now, Frank was actually due to fight Trevor Burbick in September, but he had to pull out through injury, so Bugner, 37, stepped in for a Battle of Britain clash. And Frank explained that Joe was also shooting his mouth off and telling the press how he was going to knock me out. He kept referring to me as a boy, and although I tried not to show it, it did get under my skin a bit. By the time the fight came round, I was raring to go and in tremendous condition. I was determined to ram Joe's words down his throat, and so it proved. I boxed well on the night, and Joe didn't have a look in. It took me 8 rounds to see him off, but I was quite pleased to have a decent workout. So that workout actually ranked him as the #1 contender for the undisputed heavyweight crown, and of course a fight against Mike Tyson. And Frank actually said that the fight with Tyson was actually initially scheduled to take place on June 24, 1988 at Wembley. But then Jim Jacobs, who was guiding Mike's career at the time, gave the date and the venue the blessing, so it looked like it was on. But as we know and have explained in our Legendary Nights episode, this fight would have more ups and downs than the fight itself.
Well, we're going to let Frank explain what happened, and he said in his words, "Then, in the spring of 1988, just as contracts were being drawn up, Jacobs died suddenly. I immediately sensed there would be aggro, and that feeling only heightened when Mike came out and said he had no intention of being managed by Jacobs' partner, a guy called Bill Caton. As a result, the Wembley fight was scrapped. I was gutted, and my mood wasn't helped when he fought Michael Spinks on June 27th. Frank and Terry went to the fight and the post-fight press conference, and it didn't look likely that he would be getting his chance, especially when Tyson said he was taking 2 months off and that he didn't want to fight in England. Once again, we're going to let Frank explain the whole ordeal, and he said, "Despite what Mike had said, we were suddenly on again for a Wembley showdown on October 8th, 1988. Then 6 weeks before the fight, Mike got into a 4 a.m. street fight with a former opponent called Mitch Blood Green. He fractured his right wrist, so the fight was put off for 2 weeks until October 22nd. Then things got worse. Tyson, who seemed to be in the paper every day running away from the paparazzi photographers, smashed his car into a tree and he was knocked unconscious. With only a few weeks until our fight, it was scrapped entirely. Once Mike had recovered from the crash, things took yet another twist when we found that Don King was now pretty much the main man in Team Tyson, having officially replaced Bill Caton. King was keen to make things happen, and come the end of 1988, we finally had a date set, February the 25th, 1989. There was one rather big snag though. It was at the Hilton Hotel in Las Vegas, and not Wembley in London.
Frank's continued, he said, I wasn't overly pleased when Terry told me because I wanted to take on Tyson in front of my own fans. But deep down, we both knew that the chances of that ever happening were becoming more and more remote. I'd seen the fight shift 6 times in just 8 months, which must have been a new record. Bill Caton, who was now out of the picture completely, he told Boxing News King convinced him, as in Tyson, not to go over to London because Jarvis Astaire and Mickey Duff would not allow King to be involved in the promotion. Bruno lost out on fighting in front of his beloved fans and making not only himself a load of money, but Mike Tyson too. His purse was actually doubled to $2 million due to him being messed around for those 8 months, but it was way short of what he would have earned. Finally, on December the 15th, 1988, it was officially announced the long-awaited Mike Tyson and Frank Bruno fight would take place on that exact date, February the 25th, 1989, at Las Vegas Hilton in Nevada. Bruno had spent the year out of the ring doing his HP Sauce adverts, and they were actually sponsoring his training camp in Arizona, and the newspapers, well, they pulled out a couple of funny headliners. You know how it is. And these were a couple of them. So, does Frank have the bottle to beat Tyson? And will Tyson's past catch up with him? Even when Bruno was preparing for the biggest fight of his career, Tyson's life was still just absolute chaos. And Tyson recalled that the soap drama just carried on and on and on. He was facing 2 claims of sexual harassment from women. He got into a fight with the media, smashing cameras. And then less than 2 weeks before our fight, he got a quickie divorce. He signed the paperwork on Valentine's Day, giving the American papers the perfect headline. Oh, and he was issued with a $5 million lawsuit by his trainer or former trainer, Kevin Rooney.
George Francis was now very much the lead man in preparing Frank, who recalled his rally cry during one sparring session and said, "He'll fight from the gutter, Frank. He'll hammer you with everything, his elbows, his head. He'll aim for your balls. He'll target your kidneys. He's going to rough you up. Don't expect any favours from the referee either. This is what Tyson does, and the referee won't come to your aid. So when he fights dirty, you fight dirty. When he goes low, you go low." With the fight edging closer, Frank admitted that it was difficult to be away from his family. His emotional appearance on the Terry Wogan show via satellite showed that, but he also suffered some little tricks from Team Tyson, and he recalled, "Tyson's got Las Vegas all sussed out. He knows all the tricks to play. He and Don King would play. In someone's backyard, they will do everything to make you unstable, send people to your room, keep you waiting. It's all tactics, but I had to try and stay calm and get on with it. If you know the nature of the beast, that is what he tried to do. Intimidate people, so the fight was won before a punch was even thrown. Don King was a master of it. They used psychology on you. Don King went to prison, and what he learned about psychology, he got even more slippery. During the weigh-in, Tyson tried to intimidate Bruno, but it didn't work. Tyson remembered that Bruno didn't look scared like most of his other opponents, and he recalled, "At the weigh-in, Bruno attempted to stare me down, so I pulled my shorts down and showed him my pubic hair."
So the hype that surrounded the fight affected Frank. Years later, he actually admitted that the week of the fight, we had a lot of press conferences with Don King promoting and controlling it. It was like he was fighting, not me or Mike Tyson. Every time he went to do some radio, talk to the press, go on TV, do chat shows, it was very draining. 2,000 Brits travelled to America to support Frank, paying hefty prices for their tickets in the process, but they made their voices heard, and all Bruno heard was, "Bruno, Bruno," which is booming out. And Vegas had never seen a British invasion on this scale. And Bruno says, "I was determined not to let them down." Bruno, 27, who had been out of the ring now for 16 months, had finally made it to the ring to face the feared Mike Tyson. And he recalled that when he entered the ring, Mike walked around me like a wild animal to intimidate. But that was what it was all about. So we have been through the fight on Legendary Nights episode, so we won't go into it in great detail. But in short, Bruno found himself on the deck within the first few seconds, after an onslaught of punches. And just 12 seconds actually had elapsed when Bruno crashed to the canvas near the ropes. And Frank, of course, we love with these career profiles, you've got to keep referring to it if you can get it. And Frank says himself that the power of the shot rippled through my body and my legs gave way. As I sank to one knee, he punished me with a right. The gutter tactics were alive and well, just like George had warned. The referee started counting, but I was straight up. My pride was hurt more than anything else. And I nodded towards George. That was okay.
Reflecting on what happened next, Frank said, "As we entered the last minute of the round, I finally started to feel settled. I was working behind my left jab and found a way through with a left hook. I heard George screaming at me, willing me on, so I stepped inside and landed with a short right and then a left hook. It was as good as any punch I'd thrown in my life. It smashed into Tyson's jaw and his legs immediately buckled. Suddenly, he was breakdancing in front of me, his eyes glazed over, but before I could reload, he'd fallen against me and was holding on. That moment forced Harry Carpenter to shout the famous line, 'Get in there, Frank!' As the bell ended for the first round, the crowd went wild in approval, and HBO commentator Larry Merchant echoed the same thoughts as Ian Darke. One man down, another man wobbled. I'll take it. On radio commentary, Ian Darke said, 'What an opening round this is. A left hook from Bruno wobbles Tyson, and they give one another a glance at the bell.' Bruno had some more good moments in the next 2 rounds, but Tyson started to take control before going up a gear. When Bruno returned to the corner after the third, he was told to put pressure on him. In the 5th, Bruno held on valiantly. With his nose and mouth bleeding, he took numerous punches while his back was on the ropes. A thumping left hook to the jaw sent Bruno into the ropes, and the champion was all over Frank. Frank recalled, "I was trying hard to defend myself as hooks and crosses rained in. Then he completely unhinged me with a right hook, followed immediately by a right uppercut. It nearly lifted my head off my shoulders."
He then confessed that I was conscious but badly dazed when referee Richard Steele pulled Tyson off and grabbed me. Suddenly, I was in Terry's arms, who had been running around the ring, about to throw in the towel. Tyson fell to his knees, and I sunk to my stool in the corner. Tyson was generous in his praise of Frank Bruno after the fight. He said, "Shit, man, you really had me going in the first round there. You can have another shot any time they can get it together. You deserve it." You would have thought that the defeat would have ended Frank's career, or at least his time in the limelight. But the manner of his defeat actually endeared him to the public even more than he already was. And he arrived back in England, not as a loser, but as a hero. But he was honest about his disappointment. He said, "It's so difficult, you know. I went in there 100% confident and I get knocked down. So that messed up my confidence, my balance and everything. I'm not making excuses. Mike Tyson is a good fighter and I can't take that away from him. There would be changes after the Tyson fight." And Frank said, "My defeat to Tyson had created a fair amount of aggravation, and the first issue to deal with was Terry. As hard as it was to admit it, our relationship wasn't working. Cracks had been starting to show, so after the Tyson fight, we decided to go our separate ways. It was a tough decision to make. He considered Terry to be a father figure to him, and they had been working together now for almost 10 years by this point. But they were no longer as tight as they once were, and Frank decided to get his missus on board. So this is what he said. He said, by then Laura was actually running a lot of the business side of my life, so it made sense for her to take on more control along with Mickey Duff.
Frank also said, "I've not got a bad word to say about the job Terry did though. He'd always been honest with me, but we'd simply reached the end of the line." Following the defeat, Frank cashed in on his publicity. He didn't retire from boxing completely, but he opted to take a break from the ring and earn money in other ways. And he said, "The interest after the Tyson fight couldn't have arrived at a better time either. I knew I needed a good few months off from boxing to recover, so throwing myself into other work suited me down to the ground. Pretty soon, it wasn't just the media who wanted a piece of the action. Different companies and businesses were lining up to get me to endorse their products, and within a few months, I was on more TV adverts than a bleeding Andrex puppy. In December of 1989, the BBC Overseas Sports Personality Award went to Mike Tyson, and he was presented the award by Harry Carpenter, while Frank Bruno watched on. Attention soon turned to Bruno, who was embarrassed by his panto performances in front of Tyson. We did explain this in our Legendary Nights episode. Now, in the same year, Frank was awarded an MBE in the Queen's Honours List for his services to boxing. Frank declared, "There were also walk-on parts in TV shows, sit-down interviews with the likes of Michael Parkinson and Terry Wogan. Contracts were even being waved around left, right and centre for me to appear in panto. When Laura and I finally got round to getting married in February 1990, the offers to take photos of the big day for glossy magazine spreads went through the roof, and we embraced them all."
Business outside of the ring was going really well. And he said it was around this time that Michael Aspel even turned up with his famous red book and uttered those immortal words, "Frank Bruno, this is your life." I got a bit of stick about the work I was doing outside the boxing ring from sports writers, but I didn't care one bit. If I can take some money while I am not a fighter, then why not? That's what I would tell people who threw stones at me. Besides, making people laugh and smile seemed to come pretty easily to me. What was the problem? Made sense. So Bruno had still not returned to the ring. He was obviously enjoying doing his other things when Mike Tyson was knocked out by Buster Douglas in Tokyo, Japan. Again, check out our Legendary Nights episode from season 1 for more details on that fight. But seeing that must have given Frank that fire in his belly to want to make that return to the ring. He was even still training every single day, and he made his intentions clear when he told reporters that he had a good year and a nice time ducking and diving away from the sport, but like a bad itch, he wanted to make another push for that world title. That was when he began to have problems with his right eye, which actually resulted in persistent headaches. So he went to see Dr. McLeod about it. He was told that his right retina had been torn during that Tyson fight and that surgery would repair it. And Dr. McLeod told him that they wouldn't know if he would be able to box again until after he had that surgery. So Frank said, "Once again, I was in the hands of the medics." That was nerve-wracking enough that when the papers got hold of the story, and all of a sudden everyone seemed to be an expert on eyes.
He recollected that journalist who had been saying they couldn't wait to see me fight again, and that my comeback was the shot in the arm British boxing needed, was suddenly calling on me to retire. The procedure took less than half an hour, but he would have to wait a month to find out if he could fight again. It must have been the longest month of his life, but then Dr. McLeod gave him the news. "Your eye, Frank, is as good as new." Now, as an eye specialist, I'd never recommend anyone to box, but medically, I cannot see any reason why you should not fight again. Frank released a statement to the press stating that he would be returning, and at the age of 29, he felt like he was still young in terms of the heavyweight division. Then, there was the small matter of finding someone who could take care of his world heavyweight title bid. Barry Hearn, who had promoted the Bruno Bugner fight, was a strong possibility, but Frank went with who he knew best and chose to link up with Mickey Duff once again. With Bruno and Duff back together and ready to make their assault on the heavyweight title, they just needed the British Boxing Board of Control to give his health the all clear and hand him a boxing licence. After much scrutiny, the board handed Bruno his boxing licence, and he was all set for his return in late 1991. British boxing at this point was actually under a lot of scrutiny following the tragedy of the Eubank-Watson fight at White Hart Lane that left Michael Watson with life-changing injuries. Frank even snuck into hospital to visit Watson, where he said a quiet prayer for his dear boxing friend. He now had to clear his mind and prepare for his long-awaited return on November the 20th, 1991 at the Royal Albert Hall.
Life was good to Frank and Laura during his hiatus from the sport, and he recalled that my media and TV work had seen us make a tidy sum, and Laura and I started married life by moving to some nice houses in Essex, and then eventually into a lovely new gaff in Stondon Massey near Brentwood in Essex. Set in 80 acres of lush green countryside, it was the home I'd always been dreaming of living in. I'd certainly come a long way from Oak Hall. So it had been 33 months since his defeat to Mike Tyson, but Bruno began his comeback against John Emmon. A big right hand finished him off in the first round, and Harry Carpenter, who sat on commentary duty, said, "It's official. Frank is back." Bruno told the media, "I'm 31 and I feel the best I've ever felt in my life. I'm mature. I've got more hairs on my chest. Look at that. I feel strong than what I did when I was 28, 25. On April 22nd, 1992, Bruno began his climb up towards the world rankings. He left Jose Ribalta rendered unconscious in 2 rounds with his powerful right hand. Then 7 months later, he was back at Wembley Stadium against Pierre Coetzer, and the fight lasted just 8 rounds until Bruno landed his trademark right and forced the South African's corner to throw in the towel. Then on April 24, 1993, Bruno stopped Carl Williams in 10 rounds at the National Exhibition Centre in Birmingham, which set up a domestic clash with the undefeated WBC heavyweight champion at the time, Lennox Lewis, on October the 1st, 1993. Now, we did a revisited special on Bruno Lewis. Please do listen to that on the BTR main feed platform. But this was a fight that sparked a hell of a lot of interest on these shores, and there was a lot of bad blood between the pair.
At first, the trash talking was all part of selling tickets. It never got too personal. But then, as Frank remembered, when the paper started saying Lennox Lewis had called me an Uncle Tom, I really flipped. I had to get back on the blower to Henry Brandman, who I was certainly keeping busy at that time. He issued a writ for libel and Lennox ended up denying he'd ever said it. But I was glad people had seen how strongly I felt. Those words really hurt Frank. He explained more in his book about why it hurt him, that he had to deal with racism all his life, and those sentiments were very raw just before the fight. Frank said, "I've never let myself get heavily involved in the black-white debate because I see people as people. I'm very proud of my West Indian background, but at the same time, I don't feel a great need to go around shouting about it. I'm proud to be British, and I'm proud to wrap myself up in the Union Jack. What makes Great Britain so special, in my opinion, is that there is room for everyone. But for a long time, it seemed people didn't believe there was room for me. They called me racist names and described me as a sellout. But that wasn't the worst of it. The fame of Frank had taken its toll on Mrs. Bruno's own life after she was targeted by racists. The Southwark Crown Court heard that Lynette was forced to move house after receiving death threats when the Nazi magazine published her address and telephone number, urging readers to harass her. The press reported that Mark Atkinson, a dustman, showed no emotion as Judge George Bathurst Norman said that in 37 years in the legal profession, he had never encountered such vile outpourings of hatred and incitement to violence as in these magazines.
Yeah, the report continued that Mrs. Bruno told the court how she received a swastika bearing letter saying "go home and die." Then came a series of equally frightening phone calls full of abuse, followed by a second letter which warned, "Bang, it is that easy to blow your head off." As a result, she endured many sleepless nights, was forced to move house, and more than a year later was still too scared to go home alone in the evening. With this going on in the background, there was no wonder that Frank's patience towards Lennox Lewis diminished, but there was still a fight and he had to prepare himself for it. It took place at the National Stadium in Cardiff and turned out to be a memorable British world title fight. Frank explained the beginning of the fight. He said, "The first 3 rounds were probably the best I'd ever boxed in my career. I outfought and outfought him. I was landing right crosses by feinting with jab, and I could see it was confusing the hell out of him. I gave Lennox a knowing smile at the end of the third, and he knew he was in for a fight and that he wasn't standing across the ring with a pantomime dame." That was also the name that Lennox Lewis had called him before the fight. Bruno felt in control for the next 3 rounds and believed he was up on the scorecards by this point. Then came the 7th, and this is what he remembered. "The crowd were roaring me on, and they were going crazy, and I had him up against the ropes midway through the round. I was unloading with left hooks and clubbing rights. All the anger from the build-up was pouring out. I heard George scream, "One more, Frank, one more and you've got him." It's one of the last things I remember about the fight.
Frank explained that he remembered the rally cry from George and Lennox stepping on my foot as we got tied up. The referee stepped in, and as he pulled us apart, for the first time in the fight, Lennox moved a split second quicker, and then he was on me like a flash. Before I could react, he landed a devastating punch, but it wasn't the right we were so worried about in training. No, it was a bomb of a left hand which surfaced from nowhere. It rocked me to my boots, and suddenly I was on the ropes and in a world of trouble. Lewis then went on to stop Bruno and end his third world title bid. That loss was tough to take, and Bruno said, "Afterwards, my mood was the lowest it had been following any defeat, and the post-fight press conference wasn't the friendliest. I was bruised and feeling low, and a lot of the anger from what had happened in the build-up to the fight was still there. But I can't deny Lennox deserved his victory, and any issues we had are now firmly in the past." The defeat to Lewis really knocked Frank's confidence, and it certainly made him think long and hard about continuing. But he decided to give it one more crack, and he teamed up with Frank Warren, returning to the ring on March 16, 1994 to stop Jesse Ferguson in the first round at the National Exhibition Centre in Birmingham. Frank Warren said afterwards, "This man is going to win a world title for Britain." Duke Mackenzie said Frank Bruno was on a mission. The flame that was burning inside of him to be a heavyweight champion of the world was still burning bright. And Frank Bruno echoed those sentiments and said, "Every fight is a step closer, because if you lose, there's no more stepping. You've just got to step backwards."
Bruno fought twice in 1995, first in February when he knocked out Rodolphe Marin in the very first round, and then in Glasgow on May 13 when he knocked out Mike Evans in the second round. Frank had beaten a string of journeymen to keep himself in the heavyweight mix and somehow still managed to become a worthy contender for the WBC title, which was now held by Oliver McCall, who had stopped Lennox Lewis the year before. He remembered that, this is Frank remembering, Don, Frank, me and Laura sat down in a room at the Grosvenor Hotel in London in the late spring of 1995 to thrash things out. It was a good job McCall wasn't there. If he was, he might not have liked what King was about to say. And it's what he said. He said, "One condition attached to this fight, Frank." Don said, looking at me, "Win, you have to fight Mike Tyson in your first defence. That's the deal. Take it or leave it." It was the usual hardball stuff from the nonsense American, but I didn't blink for a second. The deal was signed, and this really was the last chance saloon for Frank Bruno. 3 weeks later, after that meeting, his son Franklin was born, giving him even more motivation to finally get the job done. And he said, "Having a son as well as 2 daughters made me feel like my life was complete. All I needed now was that heavyweight title." He went off to Lanzarote to train like a man possessed. Having sparred with McCall years earlier, he had an idea of what to expect. And he said, "I told George how I remembered he was an absolute sucker for my jab, recalling how it attracted him like honey to a bee." George, meanwhile, had done his homework too by watching all of McCall's other fights. He warned me the nuclear right hand that he had landed on Lewis was far from a lucky punch.
They worked out how to nullify his right hand, and he said, "We worked over and over again on my footwork by shifting to the right with my left hand high. It became so natural that in the end, it was the first thing I was doing when I jumped out of bed in the morning." Frank explained his training regime in great detail, and he said, "In the mornings, there were body stretching exercises, workouts with weights, agonising medicine ball reps, sit-ups, press-ups, then more running and skipping. Nothing went into my body but goodness. For breakfast, it was cornmeal porridge and ginseng with grilled eggs, sausages, bacon and beans. Luckily, there was no shortage of HP sauce. I'd then have an hour-long steam and massage before heading back to the gym for work on a heavy punch bag and then the speedball. After a lunch of fish or steamed chicken and a mountain of veg, I'd be in the ring for 8 to 10 rounds of sparring with boxers flowing in from America. All of them were picked to try and match McCall's style as closely as possible. Then after that, it was George's idea of a warm down, which was 15 minutes skipping, 15 minutes on the bike, then a swim of 20 lengths in the pool. Dinner would be steak or pasta, followed by as much fruit as I could eat. Then at 10 p.m. on the dot, it was lights out and time to get ready to repeat the next day. And the next. And the next. It was relentless, but it had to be. Frank was now more than ready to put his hard work to the test. Then the trash talk began at the first press conference. McCall grabbed the microphone and screamed, "I'm going to do to you what Nigel did to McClellan. I'm here for vengeance."
And then McCall began with the Uncle Tom stuff again, like Lennox Lewis, criticising Frank for turning his back on my brothers. Next, he commented on Frank marrying a white girl as well, way below the belt. He was desperately trying to get under Bruno's skin, but it didn't work. He didn't allow himself to get wrapped up with the insults like he had done with Lewis. He remained quiet throughout. He only wanted to do his talking with his fists in the ring. He even brought in TV hypnotist Paul McKenna, who helped Frank get into the right frame of mind. He was actually recommended by his pal, Nigel Benn. He wasn't hypnotised or anything by him, but McKenna helped Frank to focus on his strengths and how to relax his mind in the most troubling of situations, like being in a ring. He now felt like he had the perfect ingredients, with George showing him combinations, McKenna teaching him how to control his mind, and in the third person, whatever you want to call it, with him was God. He even said a little prayer in his dressing room before the fight, which of course took place at Wembley Stadium to accommodate the thousands of fans who wanted to support our beloved Frank Bruno. On September the 2nd, 1995, in front of over 20,000 supporters who roared once again, as they always did, "Bruno, Bruno," as he entered the ring, Frank had his date with destiny. The first 3 rounds were controlled by Frank Bruno, who kept McCall on the end of that jab, apart from his eye actually getting scratched by the glove of McCall in the very first round, but he still felt calm. Now, he remembered catching McCall in the 4th round, but he showed his experience. He said, "I really rocked him, a perfect left hook that had him swaying, and for a split second, I thought about moving in. Then I remembered McCall's victory over Lennox Lewis. He landed a right as Lennox Lewis was moving in himself. So I stepped back and relied on my jab again."
George screamed from the corner, "Smart boxing, Frank." He knew better than anyone how far I'd come. His eye flared up again in the 6th, but he never mentioned it to George. But he later admitted, "I was basically boxing with one eye from the 6th round on, but at least I had 20,000 people in my corner, and I needed each and every one of them." McCall was on the front foot and landed some good shots. It was his best round. Frank continued to clock up another couple of rounds by switching stance, which confused McCall, who then came out like a man possessed in the 9th and caught Bruno with a solid uppercut in the 10th. "Stay focused, Frank," George screamed from the corner. Nigel Benn, standing at the ring apron, was going crazy. He was boxing every round with me. McCall took the last 2 rounds in desperation, throwing more punches in the 12th and final round than he had done the whole fight. But Frank Bruno desperately held on to hear the final bell. He wasn't completely sure of victory himself and wouldn't rest on his laurels. Part of his hesitance in some part was due to the co-promoter, Mr. Slippery Dodgy Don King, and he explained, when dealing with Don King, who was half of the promoter for the show, he could have put a brown envelope in the judge's way or got the judges a nice girl the night before to soften him up and change the verdict. So you've got to be on your toes when you're dealing with King. Ian Dark admitted he allowed the emotions of the night to get the better of him, declaring, "As a boxing commentator, one of your jobs when a fight goes a distance is to try and guide viewers quickly as to who you think is going to get the decision." But he was unable to control himself.
Yeah, Ian Dark actually shouted, "Bruno must be mile ahead on points. He must be the world heavyweight champion." It was more than a prediction. It was an outpouring of emotion, he said. We're going to use Stan Hayes' article from The Independent. We use it in a Legendary Night episode, but we must use it again because it explains this moment to an absolute T. And he wrote, Amid scenes verging on mass hysteria, at the fourth attempt, Frank Bruno finally claimed a world heavyweight title when he produced an astonishing and stirring performance to outpoint the reigning WBC champion Oliver McCall. Bruno thereby became the first British heavyweight this century not only to win a world title on home soil, but also to hold one as of right now. The unanimous verdict to the Englishman triggered off a torrent of patriotic enthusiasm and celebrations around the stadium as fireworks and red, white and blue bunting rained down from the skies. It was a tremendous sight. And obviously Frank remembers this magic moment years later. And he says, even now, just thinking about those words leaves me with goosebumps. We have a unanimous decision. The winner, the new heavyweight champion of the world, Frank Bruno. He said, what a moment. I'd truly reached the top of the mountain. He really had. When Bruno was interviewed by Ian Darke, he was overcome with emotions. He was crying and all sorts, and he explained, I struggled to find the words until suddenly from the pit of my stomach, I blurted out, I'm no Uncle Tom. No way. I love my brother. I'm not an Uncle Tom. I love my people. I'm not a sellout. I didn't plan to say it. It just happened. And when Frank arrived back at the family home, he handed his belt over to his girls and a cup of tea and a bath. I mean, what a way for the world heavyweight champion to celebrate.
After managing only a few hours' sleep, he recalled, I lay Franklin down alongside the belt and said to him, this is for you, Franklin. One day you'll be as proud of your dad as I was of mine. And one day you will understand that I won this for you. It had taken Frank Bruno 13 years to become a world champion, and he had finally done it. The People's Champion went through London on an open-top bus, and thousands came out to see the heavyweight national hero. It was like a football parade celebrating their league or cup win, and it just demonstrated the love and admiration this country had for Frank Bruno. He had nothing more to prove, but he felt like he did, and that was to make his first defence against Mike Tyson. The fight took place on March 16, 1996, at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, promoted again by Don King Productions. The fight was televised live on pay-per-view by Showtime. Now, even though Tyson was the contender, he entered the fight as the 5-1 favourite and received the higher purse of $30 million, while Bruno scooped $6 million. The fight should never have happened, as we will explain in a moment, but it was over in just 3 rounds. The end was described by Richard Hoffa in Sports Illustrated when he wrote, Tyson unleashed a 13-punch sequence that started with a right hand to Bruno's body and ended with a left hook that sent Bruno crashing into the ropes. Then referee Mills Lane intervened and stopped the fight. After the rematch, Bruno wouldn't immediately confirm his retirement. He gave himself time to digest what had just happened and to ponder his decision. But then 5 months later, he made a public statement, announcing my retirement from boxing on that day, August 30th, 1996, will always remain one of the toughest moments of my life.
So Bruno continued, he said, I lost my world title 5 months earlier in a brutal defeat to Mike Tyson. But the truth is, I probably should never have actually been allowed to step in the ring to fight Mike Tyson. The injury I sustained against Oliver McCall in my title win meant I effectively went into that Tyson bout with only one eye working properly. It wasn't really Frank that made the decision for him. It was actually the doctor, McLeod, who actually told him after the Tyson rematch, your right eye is damaged to such an extent, Frank, that one more blow could lead to you losing your vision in it. So, I mean, it's crazy. After the press conference where he announced his retirement, George Francis, who had been sitting next to Frank when he addressed the media, actually pulled him to one side and he said, you know the real fight starts now, don't you, Frank? I looked at George nervously and smiled. Then I laughed half-heartedly and put my arm around his shoulder. I'm good, George, I said. Everything's going to be fine. Don't worry, boss. But it wasn't, and Frank explained again. He said, I couldn't have been more wrong, and in the early days after my retirement, it felt like a part of me had died. The first few weeks and months felt similar to a grieving process. I kept thinking and hoping that I'd suddenly wake up one morning and the sense of loss inside of me would start to fade away. It didn't. Like a cancer, it just grew inside me. The routine and structure of boxing had provided me with had suddenly gone, and without it, I suddenly felt lost and vulnerable. I was in total limbo. Now, initially in early retirement, Frank managed to cope without the routine that boxing had given him, because he had no shortage of jobs, basically. But he missed that adrenaline. And for him, it was like a drug, and it was like a drug that he could never recreate.
He said sadly, pretty quickly it started to have a big effect on my mood. I felt miserable a lot of the time, and I became down and depressed. I felt edgy a lot too, and I soon noticed my mind would easily race away with itself. I was frequently anxious and could often be very irritable. All of these emotions felt alien to me and to those around me. Frank threw himself into training because that was all he knew. It was the only thing that kept his mind level. Family and friends would tell him that he needed to slow down and enjoy his retirement, but he couldn't do it. In the end, he had to admit that something wasn't right, and he reminisced. Even though I knew I was unwell, I was still very reluctant to see a doctor. I eventually agreed in 1998, but when a psychiatrist diagnosed me with bipolar disorder, I thought he was talking a load of nonsense. I couldn't even say the name of the condition, let alone understand it. He knew that he had ADHD, but when someone explained the symptoms of bipolar disorder, he began to realise that he was showing signs. However, there was still a stigma towards mental health in the 90s, and Frank wasn't ready to accept it. In his mind, he wasn't bonkers, mad, or a loon, so instead, he turned to cocaine. And he admitted, I wasn't doing it every night, and thankfully I never became addicted, but during my darkest days, when I was on my knees, cocaine took me away from the anguish in my mind. In the end, Frank began to allow the hangers-on into his life, and in turn, he neglected his family, which resulted in him and Laura getting divorced in the summer of 2001.
And Frank said it was one of the saddest days of my life. Watching Laura move out of our house on Stondon Massey with the kids was heartbreaking. He was now on his own in a big house, and Frank quite simply just went downhill. And parties now occupied his life. He recalled that I was doing DJ sets at crappy nightclubs across the country and pretending that I was really enjoying it. And I was regularly experimenting with skunk, which was puff, weed, which for someone with bipolar disorder is a particularly dangerous move. My house may have been full of people again, but they weren't friends or those who really cared about me. Over time, my behaviour became more and more erratic. I was doing strange things like cycling barefooted, wearing a gum shield. I was throwing around money like confetti and spending tons of thousands on things which a week later would end up in the skip. And I was going around making all sorts of weird promises about returning to boxing and getting my revenge on a world which I became convinced had it in for me. Then the press began to follow his every move, like savages they were back then. And for those that read the newspapers around this time, you'll always remember the bonkers Bruno headline from The Sun. Feeling paranoid, our world champion, our people's champion, had to resort to not leaving his home at all, literally leaving him even more isolated than he already felt. And he admitted, for many weeks I just shut myself away and stayed in the grounds of my home, which was the one place that the press weren't allowed into. Some nights I even slept in the boxing ring I had in the garden. I had no idea why, I just felt at peace there. Then on April 4, 2002, Frank received some devastating news that sent him into what he called an abyss.
George had been struggling to cope after his wife Joan and son Simon died within a short space of one another. Eventually, he decided he couldn't carry on anymore and committed suicide. Frank was severely affected by George's unexpected suicide and was now a concern not only to himself but to others. So his sister Joan moved into his home to try and keep an eye on him. However, this made him even more paranoid. Joan managed to convince him to admit himself to a rehabilitation centre, but in less than a day he had discharged himself, so the last resort was to forcibly admit him. Frank remembered the moment while his head was in a deep fog. The afternoon I saw the ambulance heading towards my house, I didn't even realise at first what was going on. I felt bewildered and confused, but when the police officers turned up and said I had to get inside the ambulance, I just flipped. I rang Cass Pennant, who raced down to the house. But unlike that day on the platform of Stratford Underground Station, Cass couldn't protect me. Instead, I was injected with powerful drugs, bundled into the back of an ambulance and driven away to Good Mayors Hospital in Romford. For some time, Frank couldn't understand what was going on. He couldn't understand why he was there and refused to admit that he had a problem. A turning point finally came when he started undergoing treatment with Dr. Stephen Pereira, the hospital's lead consultant and one of the top psychologists in the country. Frank explained that he put me on medication that stabilised my mood, including lithium and very strong tranquilizers. It helped calm me down and get me back on a bit of an even keel. I was given a concoction of 25 drugs and 25 more for the side effects.
And after 6 weeks in hospital, Bruno was finally allowed to leave. He was discharged home on the condition that he continued to take his medication while under regular supervision. He never liked people going into his house in a way, but he allowed the nurses to come in daily to monitor him closely. And although he was making progress, the medication was taking its toll on him physically. He was just too tired to do anything, and he spent a lot of his time in bed. And due to the medication, his driving licence was revoked as well. Now, while Frank was again back at his lowest but out of hospital, the ultimate betrayal surfaced. And this is what he explained. He said, a few weeks after I got out of hospital, my management team were asking a lot of questions about money. My accountants were freaking out at the amount of cash flying out of my account. The phone would ring and I'd be asked, Frank, what's going on? What are you buying? I explained that I was barely going outside the front door. I told them all I was focused on was getting better. I was terrified people wouldn't believe me and the doctors would cart me back to the hospital. So if I wasn't spending the cash, then who was mugging me off? I pleaded with my accountants to check it out. That's when things took a sinister turn. When the bank manager started to follow the money leaving my account, it became clear. I was called in for a meeting and presented with the evidence. Someone close to me had set up a system to take money from my account month after month. I could hardly get my head around what they were saying. When I was married, my wife Laura always dealt with the finances. So after we got divorced, I allowed someone else to have access to my money and help me manage things.
Frank continued and said, but that wasn't the worst of it. This betrayal started when I was sick and helpless, forcibly locked up, and went on for a long time afterwards. When I was on my knees, this person, who was supposed to be helping me, had decided to take my money. I can't tell you who it is. They know who they are and how heartbroken I am. I know there will be a guessing game now as to who it is, but I don't care. To move forward, I need to be open about my past. We no longer talk to one another, and I doubt we will again. The person sent me a letter admitting what they did, trying to make peace, but I'm not able to. I could have called in the police, but when I discovered the fraud, my main priority was to get back peace of mind, not bring more heat down on me. More than 300,000 had been stolen from his bank account. The fraud just didn't break my heart. It left me fighting for my sanity, and it sent me into a downward spiral. I started to withdraw into my own world. I didn't feel as if I could trust anyone. I shut myself off. Frank did fall victim to further visits to hospital, but by December 2005, he announced that he was to become a father for the 4th time since finding new romance with old friend Yvonne Clydesdale. The couple, who first met 5 years previously at a health resort, began dating months after bumping into each other at a wine bar near his home. Yvonne gave birth to baby Freya on May the 10th, 2006. In October, Frank and Yvonne were jointly awarded £50,000 in damages for libel against the People newspaper and publishers MGN in respect of false claims made about their relationship.
So in 2010, Bruno was out with his daughter in Milton Keynes when he was approached by a stranger who, for no reason, headbutted him in the face. Can you believe it? He said, "I try to get on with my life and not bother anyone at all, but sometimes people bother me. I'm not looking for sympathy, but people take liberties. At the time, I had to swallow it and let it go." We're living in a world today where things like that happen. You dust yourself down and you get on with it. There are some people who are a little bit more cuckoo than others. Bruno said that the culprit was never ever tracked down as well, so no one ever knew who did that. But by May 2012, he was actually living in Glasgow with a new girlfriend, Nina Coletta. Frank hired a new agent called Dave Davis, who was a great bit of business. He's really pleased he brought this guy in because he helped him. Someone that could actually help manage his affairs and events. And one of the first things that Dave actually suggested was for Frank to open up about his illness. Bruno said he was advised that he could help others. And this is what he actually said in his own words. And also start to learn more about my condition at the same time. It was good advice. And in 2017, I felt fully able to tell the world about my illness for the very first time. Then in the book, first book, Let Me Be Frank, he revealed that he was actually sectioned further 3 times after coming out of Good Mayors. He said, "I was locked up twice in 2012 and then again in 2015. Writing about those experiences in Let Me Be Frank was the hardest thing I'd ever done or had to do. After I published the book, I was inundated with letters and emails from people who have gone through equally dark times with mental health and in many cases have suffered far worse than me. Frank managed to turn his life around and he was medication free in 2016. But a year later, Lynette Bruno passed away at the age of 86.
Her death was a great loss to Frank, who said that she was the most important person in his life. He has also said that she will always be with him in spirit. Frank spoke openly about the importance of his mother in his life, and he said that she was his rock and that she always believed in him. In 2019, Frank contracted pneumonia and had to stay at the Horton General Hospital in Banbury for treatment, but it was the following year that his mental health spiralled out of control. By 2020, the coronavirus hit the world and lockdown was introduced in the UK. Bruno was sectioned during lockdown. Frank confirmed, in 2020 when COVID-19 arrived in the UK, I was forced to face up to a terrifying reality. The reality that my illness was back and that suddenly I was facing up to a whole new fight. During lockdown, Frank was told by his doctor that his recent pneumonia diagnosis meant that he was at high risk if he caught the virus, which heightened his paranoia, especially when some of his close friends began to pass away after contracting the coronavirus. He allowed social media to also get into his head, and he began to bite back when he noticed people were writing nasty messages calling him a monkey or a nigger. He began to lose a lot of weight due to overtraining and not eating enough. Plus he wasn't sleeping, so his behaviour started to become erratic. He would ring people up and leave them rambling messages, then forget that he had done it. He kept calling one friend about arranging a fight. He even left Frank Warren a voice message about making a comeback. Then he tried to buy a car for 60 grand that was worth 40 grand, but thankfully his advisors refused to release him the money.
His close friends and family became worried, obviously, so the local NHS mental health crisis team was sent out, but he managed to convince them that there was nothing wrong with him. And he actually admitted as well that one thing he had learned over the years is how to hide my condition. I've become very, very good at it, he said. In the end, it was a Zoom call with assessment with a guy called Dr. Tim Rogers that actually forced him to be sectioned again. And Frank explained that I was later informed that during that assessment, I'd become highly agitated, angry, and at times was barely making any sense. I was rambling, incoherent mess, and I was a bomb that was about to explode. So on Monday, June 29, less than 72 hours after his Zoom appointment assessment with Dr. Rogers, an ambulance arrived to admit Frank into hospital. And Frank was really struggling. He confessed, "It is very hard to put into words the terror I felt in those first few days. I was like a caged animal in the zoo who had been stripped of all his dignity. Being back inside a mental health unit after so long was a nightmare, which I feared would never end. In the end, though, Frank stayed in Luton Hospital for 6 weeks, almost the same length of time he had been at Goodmayes. Bruno told The Sun in 2021, "It has been the hardest and most terrifying time of my life. I hit rock bottom and suffered a breakdown. For my own safety and the safety of others, I was sectioned and taken back into hospital, and I had to face up to the fact that my illness had returned after years of keeping a lid on it." So he's now out. He actually goes to America. He goes and meets Mike Tyson for that final part of the documentary. And he later said that after just being with Mike for an hour, I think it was, but he said, "It sounds strange, but meeting Mike felt like being with a brother, and it somehow lifted a bit of the weight off my shoulders."
It continued to say, "I've had my run-ins, he's had his run-ins. I've had good and bad days feeling down, unable to motivate myself. Mike's been in exactly the same spot. He's been down a much rockier road than I have, but has gone through it. Listening to Mike's trials really put a lot of mine into perspective. Frank is in a better place now, and he admitted in his book, 60 Years a Fighter, Frank, Definitive and Explosive Story of My Life in and Outside the Ring, I have the strongest team around me since I was in the boxing ring, which gives me the best chance of living with my illness. Frank Bruno has raised millions for charity and has sparked an important conversation about mental health. Even Ricky Hatton spoke about the importance of speaking up about your mental health, and he said, it is so important not to be afraid to talk about the thoughts that might be going through your mind. And if two fellas, like Frank and I, can open up about our feelings and mental health, then anyone can. To know I have a man who I grew up idolising in my corner, it's a wonderful thing." Bruno has joined the Get Close and Personal platform to raise funds to support the Frank Bruno Foundation, which is dedicated to improving the mental health of men around the world. Bruno offers one-to-one video calls with anybody wanting to discuss issues related to mental health and Bruno's own journey. And he says, "I'm just a guy from South London. Nothing special, just a ducker and diver." But what he is a national treasure whose story is one of courage, determination and resilience. He also brought joy to millions, but today he just wants the quiet life.
Yeah, he told Gareth A. Davis that "I live at home myself, and I think I'll die by myself the way things are going. I want to try and live a little longer with less stress." Now, we don't always agree with Gareth A. Davis, but we do when he said, "Bruno is the king of catchphrase. He is also deserving of a new one-liner. A rise to Frank. I think he should be a sir." Frank actually wrote in his book, "I am still amazed at the level of interest there is in my life from fans. I spend a lot of time travelling the country, attending theatre shows, boxing dinners and gala nights, where I will happily talk about my career and answer questions. So, well, we're massive fans, Frank, so if you want to come and have a chat with us, we'd love to hear from you, mate." So here's some more comments to finish off this compelling career profile, which ended really heavily on mental health, but I think it's a great thing to discuss. But so Ricky Hatton, a close friend of Frank's, works with him with some of the mental health stuff he does. And Ricky said, "Frank's determination, will to win and sheer bloody mindedness inspired me to go on to the career that I had. And I know many boxers of my generation would say the same." Ian Dark said, "Nobody can take Frank's night away from him. He secured his place in history books, and the only other boxer I can think of that comes close to him in terms of popularity is the late, great Sir Henry Cooper. And that's not bad company to be in, is it?" And Johnny Nelson, he sums up this whole thing quite well, actually. He says, "If I had to sum up Frank in one word, would be humble. I don't think he realises how popular he is and how many people still adore him. He was and will always remain the people's champion."
The people's champion, indeed. And that is the life and career profile of Frank Bruno. It's one hell of a story. You know, fortunately for us, we grew up in in his era of boxing, and we were able to see and witness that most magical night in 1995. And, you know, both of us were relatively young at that point, and to see something of that nature, to see someone as humble as him and as well deserving of him as to be able to become a world heavyweight champion, he's just a brilliant story. And, you know, they make movies about many different people in sports in general, but I think from a UK perspective, I'd love to see something on Frank in the future. I'd love to see some sort of biopic, you know, aside from what we do. It'd be great to see a proper movie about him because he bloody deserves it, you know, regardless of maybe what you might think of his accolades. Okay, he fails in 3 attempts to become a champion, but does it in his 4th attempt. It's everything that surrounds him as a human being, and it's a true story of maybe not necessarily the underdog, because I think Frank always had the tools. It was obvious he always had the tools. He just had those vulnerabilities in his locker that prevented him from becoming a champion sooner. But he did it. He eventually goes on to do it and creates that little bit of history, puts his stamp in the boxing world, and more importantly, creates and cements his legacy in British boxing history. He's one of the most loved, if not the most loved fighter in British boxing history. People like Ricky Hatton have very come close to him, but I don't think anyone will ever surpass someone like a Frank Bruno. He definitely is right up there with Henry Cooper and Ricky Hatton as probably the most popular boxer that Britain's ever seen.
Yeah, I agree with you. I said at the start of the show, didn't I? I said Bruno and Henry Cooper, but you're right. I think the only other one that comes close to those is Ricky Hatton. Yeah, I suppose with Ricky, I'd say he was better than the two of them in terms of his natural ability. I mean, that's no disrespect to Frank. When he was on his night and he landed, boy, he's knocking you out. I mean, everyone said how hard he hit, even down to Mike Tyson, when he shook him to his core. But it's just the whole package with him. It was like exactly like you say, like Ricky Hatton, like Henry Cooper. Those three in particular were just idolised, and they were the people's champion. They were adored by not just their local area, but by the whole bloody country. It takes something to do that. And you do find all three of them all fit the bill for your normal guy, don't they, Sean? You could bump into them in the pub, or as Bruno said, the boozer. And they're just the normal person. They're just that, you relate to them more. And, you know, when you see them and you relate to them and then they go and do the stuff they do in the ring, it's almost like your mate's just gone in there and done it. So that was the love and admiration we have for him. And I suppose it's tough, isn't it? Because we do our career profile. They tend to always be these superstars, but, you know, we do like to do these. When we've done Henry Cooper, we should really do Ricky Hatton, but we've done Bruno now. I suppose for us, it's just about showing the younger generation that were not around at that time, we're not lucky enough to witness and be around, and just try and make them feel it. I suppose it's hard for them to notice it because I don't think you're ever going to get anything like it. And the closer you get to it, for the younger generation, is probably Ricky Hatton. But I still think Bruno was the man for me. I mean, he was loved. It was just that nice guy, and he'd do the business in the ring. Yeah, and I suppose the one thing I would say is just highlighting the mental health stuff there, Sean. I mean, what a horrible... Do you remember those days, the bonkers Bruno? It was awful, wasn't it, Sean? Just reading that, like, that was your hero. And hearing Ricky Hatton when he watched that fight with Tyson and how he literally wanted to cry when he realised Bruno lost to Tyson. I actually felt that as well, because I was at school, my mate was a Tyson fan, I was a Bruno fan, and when I woke up to hear that Bruno had lost, I literally was devastated. I didn't want to go to school because I knew I was going to get it in the neck. He just done that to you. He was that, you always rooted for Bruno, didn't you?
That's it. You did root for him. Everybody rooted for him. And I hope that by doing this career profile, not only has it brought some great memories back to people of our age and older, but it's also opened the younger generation up to go back and look at his career and, you know, look at some of these fights, and even the fights that he does lose, you know, watch how good he was in those fights, and just certain things just let him down at the last hurdle. And you can just see the story of that courage and determination, as we said at the end there, about Frank Bruno as an individual. And it really is sad to sort of hear the stories and see the stuff that went out across the newspapers in those times when he really did struggle with his mental health. I think the fact is, it's quite obvious that he's always going to have this. He's going to live with this condition for the rest of his life. He's going to have ups and downs for the rest of his life. And hopefully it's about having those right people around him to keep that maintained and managed. And, everybody that loves Bruno wishes him well. We wish him well. We would love and thrive off the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with him, to understand where he's at now and to sort of hear the stories from him firsthand. And like you've heard, he does do a lot of dinners. He still does them now. He does a lot of after speaking events. He does quite a few with Hatton as well. There's quite a few always being advertised, usually once a year or twice a year in different venues in the UK. And it's good to see that even stuff like that is obviously keeping him busy. And I hope that he does do that for him from a mental health perspective. I hope that talking about his career and talking about his struggles is kind of therapeutic in a way, like it is for so many of us men. Sometimes talking therapy is the best therapy, and I hope that what he does and how he shares that stuff with people does actually help him. I really do hope it helps, and I hope he continues to stay on an even keel, and we don't have to report any further stories in the future about his issues with mental health. And I just think it's one of those situations where unfortunately it's gonna be something that stays with him for life, and it's going to be about how he manages it and how the people around him support him. And Godspeed. I hope that never happens to him again, and as in he has to be sectioned or he has to go through a really traumatic episode. I really hope he's able to sort of overcome that and stay on an even keel for the remainder of his life. And he's just great that he's done so many things in the aftermath of his career, and like you said, Johnston, he's still so very popular. And I'm just happy that we've had the opportunity to do this episode on him, and to be able to present this story, his story, to all of our listeners. And I'm sure a lot of you guys probably will have heard Frank Bruno's story, or if you haven't, there is about 3 or 4 books out there of Frank's over the years, so it's definitely worth having a read through them books. And I hope that this episode has certainly been a good supporting act for a lot of the literature that he's already released.
Yeah, exactly. The most recent book is the book we did use. We did use, obviously, his other one as well. I think at the minute he's the only career profile we've done this season that is actually currently still alive. So we do tend to go way, way back. But it's just nice to have it, really. It's nice to be able to reflect and remember. And I watched them all. I ended up watching all the big fights as I was creating the story. And to hear about, his younger days as well, it was nice to hear some of the stuff I hadn't really heard before. So, yeah, I mean, just an absolute living legend. He really is. And the crazy thing is about him is every time I actually ever hear, if he's ever on a podcast or he's ever on YouTube or any interview, and everyone always like, Frank, mate, we love you, Frank. You know how much we love you. And he's like, he can't hear it, Sean. He can't. He literally says, no, don't. I can't. Just stop saying it. He hates it. It's always like he hates the fact that people say, Frank, mate, you're a legend. Like, you seriously, I remember this moment. And I think that's the one thing with me is you remember moments with Frank. And yeah, definitely the famous night with McCall, I'll never ever forget, because I was upstairs and Mum was working in a pub and I was supposed to be asleep, but I kept sneaking down, and just the roar in that pub. Wow. That boozer down South London, Frank, I'm telling you now, the roof blew off.
It was an unbelievable and unforgettable night, and we hope that you've really, really enjoyed this career profile. And if you have, please do let us know on social media at career_profiles on Twitter, or you can find us on any available social media platform at the BTR Boxing Podcast Network. Please do go and like and share and retweet the episode when it is out there. We do genuinely appreciate the support for what we put together for the story of those fighters and these promoters and these trainers in boxing history. If you've enjoyed it that much that you would love to get even more access to episodes that we cover in boxing history, then you could become a patron by signing up to patreon.com/BTR Boxing Podcast, and you'll be able to get access to episodes like this earlier than general release. You'll be able to get patron-only episodes, an exclusive patron-only series as well, and you will get every episode ad-free that goes onto that particular feed. So please, if you can support us in that way, go and check it out and have a look. But if you can't, give us a like, give us a share, give us a retweet. and send it to people, add it to your story on Instagram, share it on TikTok, whichever way you want to share it, please do it, because it really, really does help us and support us in our journey in boxing history and our journey in podcasting. But that is it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening to the life and the career profile of Frank Bruno.